So today we're going to talk about the labs, a little bit more about sudo, how we can control that a little bit more. Remember how when we were looking at sudo there are a whole bunch of different configuration options here. So there's a couple of things that are a little powerful that I want to talk about. Talk about sed at a basic level one more time. The one thing I didn't really talk about much on Friday was replacing the entire line when you have something matching on a particular line. I'll show how to do that. And then talk about briefly DHCP and static IPs. So for the labs, any questions on lab 2? So that was your basic sudo lab. Anything you want me to cover on that more? Alright, so we had 2 more labs that I posted here recently. So those are on D2L now on the Dropbox page. Lab 3 is SSH stuff. So I think it should be generally straightforward. Most of the content that I had on there was things that I covered during class, during the video if you want to review. But there is a whole lot of different things that you're going to have to do here, and it is a bigger lab than we've had before. So basically install SSH, add a user to do SSH things, configure it for only that user can log in, change the server port, show that you can generate and install keys, and then configure the SSH server to only allow login by key. So there's a whole lot of different things to do here. So I definitely recommend that you get started on that now. If you didn't notice, that's going to be due this Sunday at midnight. And the other assignment that we have is Lab 4, which is regular expressions. So this one should be generally easy. There's a couple online kind of regular expression challenge sites that I want you to go to and complete. Well, where was I at here? So basically you type a regular expression, at least in regex golf. There's a number of different sections here. I only want you to do the first 3 challenges. So you write a regular expression which matches these things, but does not match these things, basically. So once you had completed this page, I wanted a screenshot showing the completed regular expression, and then the same for the next 2 pages. And then there's this regex crossword, which is maybe a little bit harder to understand. But basically, there is a regular expression here, and you need to put a character here in the crossword, which satisfies both of those regular expressions. So here we have A or Z, so it would match either A or Z. We have A or B up here. So what would be a letter that would match both of those? A, yep. Pretty straightforward. And that's the tutorial, and it's pretty straightforward. So for this one, I just wanted you to complete the tutorial and wanted you to complete beginner. If you wanted to, you could, of course, go on and do a bunch more stuff. Which is kind of fun, but not required by any means. And that will kind of help you with your basic regular expression understanding, hopefully. So those are the 2 labs. Both of them are due Sunday at midnight. So if there's any questions about those, I could talk more about those now. Otherwise, feel free to bring anything up whenever you run into any problems. So anyway, going to talk more about sudo today. So let's go into a box here. And let's go and see our sudoers file. And so remember how there's these 2 different things we can do. We can say a single username here, or we can say % and then the group name, and then it will give these following sudo permissions to that particular group. So each of these things actually means something. So this component right here, this first all, means which host name are you allowed to run sudo commands on. So one thing that you might end up doing is deploying this sudoers file to a bunch of different boxes where you all have the same user. So let's say you have a bunch of different boxes, let's say Ubuntu, Ubuntu 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. You could say, I don't care, I'm going to keep this. You could say Ubuntu, and Ubuntu 2, and so on and so forth. And it would only allow you to run this particular sudo or directive on those particular host names. So that's kind of interesting, but it's only really useful if you're going to deploy the sudoers file to a bunch of different machines. What's kind of more interesting are these second two commands, components, I should say. So this first part right here, this first all, is specifying which users you can run sudo as. So by default, you could sudo to actually any user, run commands as any user. So I think I talked about this briefly earlier, but you can actually say sudo u, let's say nobody id. It actually run the id command as the nobody user. So you can actually just run a single command as any particular user, but by default, sudo runs without any u specified as root. So again, even though we're running as root right now, so it doesn't really matter. But we can actually control like who you can sudo user to. So you can sudo to users that aren't root. You can only allow certain things. So let's go ahead. We'll do a demo here. I'm going to split this terminal really quick so I can get another page here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add another user. We'll just call it sudo test. Sudo test. So let's allow that user to have full sudo permissions. So the one way we could do that, since the way that Ubuntu is configured by default, of course, is we could add that user to this sudo group right here, or second here. Or what we could do is just add their username. So what I'll do is sudo test right there, and I'll switch user over to sudo test. And then sudo I don't have a password, I gotta set my password still. We can see that I have full sudo permissions to sudo to root right there. So again, we could run a command as anybody if we wanted to. Nobody id would work just the same. But anyway, so let's go ahead and we're going to lock that down a little bit. So go back over to our main root tab here. We could say vi sudo. We won't touch the host names at all since we're just running this on one box. But let's go ahead and look at this right here. Let's change it so you can only run as the DSU user. So I'll just say DSU. And actually what the second part does is it allows you to sudo to a particular group. So we could also do things like that. So I'm gonna just delete this right now. That's optional, and we'll come back to the groups and we'll demonstrate that in a little bit here. So right now, sudo test. As soon as I close this file on the left here and log sudo tests out on the right and log them back in, all they'll be allowed to do is sudo commands specifically as DSU. Log back in. Let's just try and sudo I again. And now it says sudo test is not allowed to execute bin bash as root on Ubuntu. So that's starting to show that we can only do this particular thing. Let's try and run the same thing we ran before, just to say if we can sudo to any user, nobody id. It says sudo test is not allowed to execute bin id as nobody on root on Ubuntu. But we can, in fact, sudo to DSU and run id as DSU. So when you need to have people kind of interacting with different users, perhaps the service is running as the DSU user, but you only want to give people access via sudo test, you could actually restrict that access down to this point, and we could do that. So here's the other thing we could do. Let's look at that group really quick. So let's just set the groups. So this is kind of optional syntax here, the second component. So just remember hostname, user, group. And you can actually specify multiple users if you want to separate them by comma. So you could say DSU, user1, so on and so forth. But we'll just say DSU. So our user could switch to the DSU group without actually switching to the user entirely. So instead of using U, you say G. So you can see we still have the same user ID here. We're still sudo test, but our group user ID has switched to DSU. And just kind of interesting, just kind of part of the entire sudo syntax. Anyway, so the final thing that we can do, let's just go ahead and switch both of these back to all, is we can specify the commands that the user is allowed to run. So let's say this particular user needs to be able to configure network interfaces, but that's all they need to be able to do. It's the only root permissions we want to give to them. You could give them only permissions to use if config or something like that. So save this. I think I probably have to log out and log back in. I could say sudo ID. It says, sorry, sudo test is not allowed to execute as expected. But if we say sudo if config, okay, I've messed up something. I think I have to specify the full path as bin if config. Yeah, okay, now we're good to go. Yeah, so you have to specify the full path on those commands. So again, I can't run ID, but I can run if config. So if you need to allow a user to have one specific program running as root, you can specify that one particular program in that sudoers file. So we can specify multiple things too. Let's say I did want to be able to run. I did want to be able to run ID. I could, again, just like any of these other syntactical components, user bin ID. Just separate them by commas. Sudo ID. Did I say that right? I think I don't have a. I think I'm not allowed to have a space here. We'll see about that. Maybe there is no space. Kind of just guessing here. Anyway, but basically there's some mechanism to allow you to run those multiple commands. I think I swear it was comma separated, but guess I can't remember quite offhand. But definitely functionality worth remembering. So that's our sudo. Yeah, so I just want to talk about sed one more time. So we have this data over here, as we can recall. Let's say we wanted to replace all lines that had DSU on them with something else. So normally you'd say, let's just do this, cat data. I'm going to close out this other terminal here. You'd say cat data, pipe it through sed, and then do substitute. Let's just match DSU, and we'll replace that with match to indicate that we matched something. So we can see we replaced this match right here. So in order to match, replace the entire line, what we actually need to do is match the entire line. So sed only replaces what it matches, but we can easily get around that and easily have sed match the entire line. So we can just say dot star, so that's any character 0 or more times, and then DSU dot star, so again 0 character, or any character 0 or more times. So this allows DSU to come at the very beginning of the line. It could be the only thing in the line, or it could be at the end of the line. So you can see that replaced the entire line because it matched the entire line. So let's just look at that data a little bit more again. So let's say we had space, 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 DSU, DSU, space, 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 and we'll call that good. So if we change these stars to pluses, that would require a character to be at the beginning. That require 1 or more instead of 0 or more. So we can see now, I think I have to escape those pluses actually. We can see that this line that had that DSU in there, it had at least one character on both sides of it, was successfully matched and replaced. But these other lines that did not have characters on both sides, it had characters on this side but not characters on that side, wasn't replaced because it didn't match that regular expression with the pluses there, and this one didn't match either. Let's say we changed one of these things, so this is a star now. We would match 2 of them, but not this one. We could change it the other way around. We match, again, got to escape that plus. We would match the one here, not the one here, but the one here. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do. You can make this even more specific, I guess. By default, there's something called greed in regular expressions. An expression is going to try and match as much as it possibly can. So by default, this is kind of implied, but you could say beginning of line, end of line, just to make sure everything is working 100% according to plan. Let's say this wasn't being greedy. It might only match like one character or something like that, and it wouldn't match the rest. And we'll probably get more into more advanced regular expressions later on, but I just wanted you to have a basic understanding for now in order to be able to do some things. So yeah, that's what I wanted to cover with that. And then we're going to cover DHCP and static IPs. So one of the big things you'll probably end up doing on your Linux box is setting IP addresses and all of that. So I'm going to break, I'm SSH'd into the box right now, so I'm going to end up breaking things, whatever. So again, remember ifconfig shows your IPs. On particular systems, you might not have ifconfig. Ifconfig's kind of slowly fading away. We have IP ADDR for address, which also shows you that information, slightly different format. So in order to change those IP addresses, you could say ifconfig interface name, ENS 160, the IP address that you want, 192.168.253. We'll just use the exact same one, 54. And then in your subnet mask, so we're on a class C right now, so 24. So again, interface name, IP address, subnet mask. I didn't change anything, everything should be the same. Let's see. Route. And we still happen to have the correct route. But let's say, in this case, my VM had been DHCP'd and had obtained its IP address, had obtained its routes. But if it hadn't been, we'd have to also additionally add a route to the default gateway if we wanted things routed off of the network. So I'd say route add. The syntax is, it's one of those things where the syntax is kind of different everywhere. It's something like default GW 192.168.253.1, and occasionally you have to say also device which interface that gateway is on. So you'd say dev ENS 160. Since that's already there, I'm not going to do it. But those would be the 2 steps you'd have to do to manually set the IP address from the command line. Now, the one thing worth noting about doing things that way is those aren't persistent. So when you change an IP address with ifconfig, when you change an IP address with IP, those aren't going to be things that are saved. If you reboot your VM or other host, it's going to lose that configuration information. So we need to actually go in and configure that in a slightly different way. So again, one of those things that's different on kind of all distributions. On Ubuntu, on Debian, there's this file called etc network, and then interfaces, which works good for doing the server stuff. So CentOS, well, we're going to talk about CentOS next, I guess. But as soon as you install more networking utilities, if you have a desktop Ubuntu or something like that, there's actually something called Network Manager, which manages all of this stuff. Now, on CentOS, Network Manager manages everything by default, so it makes things a little less tricky. We don't have Network Manager running right now on our Ubuntu server, so we're using this file. But if we did have Network Manager running, we want a static IP address, so you'd have to turn Network Manager off or configure things through Network Manager. So we're just going to go ahead and do this right now. So we can see we have our interface, we have our name, inet DHCP. So let's take a look at the configuration and see what things we can do with it. So we can say man interfaces, and that will actually open up the man page for this configuration file, which is super nice to remember. So here's a quick example of what we can do. We just change that DHCP to static. We say address, our address, subnet mask, gateway, and that. And that's all we have to do. Pretty simple. Let's go down here a little bit further, and we're going to look at a couple other things that are worth noting. We probably also want to set a, let's see if we can set a DNS server here. So I guess we'll have to manually set the DNS server, but that's fine. That's completely normal. So the first thing we have to do is interfaces. Okay, just go down here, say static. We'll say address 192.168.253. We'll just keep it exactly the same so my SSH session doesn't die, 24. And then we'll say gateway 192.168.253.1. Okay, so what we're going to do is after we've changed that file, we actually need to reload our sort of networking things. So we could say system restart networking, networking. And what that will do is it will basically just restart our networking, which will parse this file, it'll look and see what we had set there, and it will use that to set our IP address. So since I didn't change anything, my session's still connected here, and everything's good to go. So the final thing we have to do is set a DNS server. So when we're doing DHCP, DHCP is managing all of that. It's automatically setting your DHCP server. So we look at this resolve.conf. So resolve.conf contains our DNS servers. At this point, I think this is still just left over from when we had DHCP running. So we just say name server and then the IP address of our DNS server. And then we also have this other directive, search, so we can actually specify what to append to a DNS name if none exists. So let's say, I'll talk about that a little bit more, look up the search name. So let's say I say look up asdf.com. That's fully, like, it's a full DNS domain path. But let's say I just looked up ASDF. In this case, it would say we hadn't found anything. But since it didn't find anything, what it would do is it would say, based on what options we had specified here, it would append this dsunix.lan to that host name. So it would first look up ASDF, just plain, and then it would append it asdf.dsunix.lan. I have a couple things on this network. let's say DC. Shoot, let's look up DC domain controller. Even though I just typed DC, it would expand that all the way to dc.dsunix.lan. So just kind of interesting behavior. But just remember, if you're doing static IP stuff, you might have to go into the resolve.conf and actually set that name server manually. So that's Ubuntu. Again, if you have Network Manager, if you have some other sort of network management stuff installed, it's going to be different. Probably different on different Ubuntu distributions, and different things change throughout the years. That's one of the things that the Ubuntu people seem to like to change all the time. So the other thing I want to talk about was CentOS. So if you remember from the very beginning of the class, on CentOS, again, uses Network Manager by default. At the beginning of the class, I said kind of how I just posted a link on how to do the static IPing stuff. So CentOS is one of those that doesn't have ifconfig on it anymore. They've moved fully over to IP and those commands. So remember, there's this what is it called? NM2E. So there's this nice kind of pseudo terminal interface to edit your IPs and everything on CentOS. Super, super nice. So I could say edit a connection. I got my ENS 160 right there. Could do things like set MAC address there, but what I'm really looking for is this IPv4 configuration. So what I can do is I can change that from automatic to manual and show that. Addresses, let's say 192.168.120, 192.168.1.1. In this particular, like with Network Manager can control all that DNS stuff too. Can control all of that, so I'll just add a DNS server while I'm at it, 168.1.1. And then we're good to go. So that's pretty nice that there's just that nice GUI to do all of that. Scroll down, back, quit, and let's see if our changes have taken effect. I think we're going to have to just network restart just like before, but let's just check it out first to see. And so, no, it looks like that stuff automatically restarted our networking for us. So if you want to do it through the GUI, that's cool. That's how I would do it if I had a one-off thing. But you can't really do it programmatically through the GUI, so there's this other directory, network scripts, so I'll just print that out really quick, pwd, etc sysconfig network scripts, and for every interface that you have, you'll see an ifconfig ENS 160. So all of the things that we just set, if I know what I'm talking about, should be visible in that configuration file. ENS 160. And we can see we have our IP address, we have our gateway, we have our DNS. So if we wanted to, let's say, modify our IP address with sed, we could do something like that and do things like that. The GUI is just really nice for one-off things where you don't have to remember anything. So since we're on that note, since I remembered that, let's go ahead and replace our IP address with sed. That sounds like fun. So what we could do is say sed, and my terminal there it goes, clear. I'll just quickly grep so we're going to try and match IP adder equals, and then we want to capture everything after that, or let's capture everything before it, and then we'll just replace the entire line after it. That sounds like a plan. So let's just do a drive run right now. We'll cat ifconfig ENS 160. I'll move this up, sorry, and the font's small and I don't know if I can actually really do anything about it. Since I'm on the iLab here, so cat ifconfig ENS160 sed, and we will substitute. Let's capture that. Which one do we want to capture? IP adder equals and dot star. So we'll just again do our little thing here where we have end of line, beginning of line. And let's just test and see if we can just remove that really quick. So we can see we did actually end up removing that IP adder line. So what we could do is we could say /1 192.168.10 dot, or let's say 1.99. That sounds good. We run it through again, and we have that printed out. So as I was thinking about this, we wouldn't even specifically need to capture anything. We're capturing IP adder right now, and remember we had the /1, which will place our first capture group in our regular expression back in our output. So this will find capture group 1, and it will drop it in right there. So we could do this slightly differently too. We could actually just replace the entire thing. We could just say IP adder equal, and then we could just manually type that in. IP adder equal, and then that would work out just fine too. And we can see we had programmatically changed our IP address. So if you were running a shell script that you needed to change your IP address or something like that, you could run that sed. Of course, you need to say sed I and then say the file name at the very end, and it would actually modify the file right there. Or is it sed E? Yeah, it's sed E. It's sed E to modify the file without printing it or anything. And then you'd also have to do a service, networking, something like that, restart to actually load those changes. So let's look at a slightly different sed example here, since we're still on that, I guess. Let's say we wanted to only print the IP address. So we wanted to get the IP address from this file, not the current IP address, specifically from this file. Here we got the directive, but let's say we wanted just the address. We could capture just this output after the equal sign, and then print only that particular group. /1. And there we can see we retrieved the IP address from that configuration file. So kind of underwhelming, but ultimately a good place to start. Alright, so let's see, did I cover everything I wanted to today? So DHCP static IP. The other thing, okay, here's the other thing we wanted to do. I'm going to go back over to my Ubuntu box. Just reset this back over to DHCP, restart everything. So, final page client. Okay. Final thing I want to talk about was renewing an IP address that has been DHCP'd on Linux. So the one easy way we can do it is actually systemctl restart networking. That will actually kill all the DHCP processes, and it will restart them. They'll reacquire new leases, hopefully. So when we are running DHCP, we'll actually have this nice little output right here. It will tell us things like when we actually got our DHCP lease and things like that. So in order to see that information, we would just say systemctl status networking. Let's restart it again. Note our time right here. So 10:36:40. Let's go ahead, restart it again. See, there's a little bit of time there, so hopefully what that indicates is that we're actually getting a lease. And we can see now it's 10:37. So every single time we ran that command, that restart, we can see there is this new chain of DHCP requests. So that's the way it works on new systems. On older systems, you might have to do it manually. Say DH client R for remove. That's ENS 160 again. DH client R ENS 160. That would remove your lease for that interface. Kill the old processes. Oh, great, yeah. So in this case, I happen to be SSH'd into this VM. And of course, when I removed the DHCP address, it no longer had an IP address, and now I can't SSH into it anymore. So that was intelligent of me. But let's say you had console access, what you would continue on to do, you'd say DH client R ENS 160, and then you'd say DH client, and then the interface name to obtain a DHCP lease. So instead of doing all of this stuff, perhaps a better way to do it, the way that I like to do things when I'm setting things up, is actually set static DHCP leases. So I'm trying to get this entire VApp configured, then I'll hopefully deploy it out to you in a little bit here, have some kind of networking things to work on. But the way, if I write this up, services, DHCP server, that I like to do things is set static DHCP leases. Glitchy. So we can do, in at least PF sense, you can go in, you can see I actually already have static DHCP mapping set up for these devices. Let's see if I can find status here. Status is what I want. I can look at the clients that I have currently, and I can actually set a static DHCP lease or static mapping. So I say their MAC address and I say their IP address that I want them to get. And what this allows us to do is configure all of the IP addresses for all of our boxes all in one place. So I like to do this because I don't have to go around to each individual box, figure out how to configure the IP address. Let's say I'm dealing with 10 different distributions for some terrible reason. If you have to deal with 10 distributions, that's just not going to be a good time. But let's say I am. I don't have to figure out how to change their IP address, set static, any of those things. If I want to change their IP address, I don't have to manually log in. I can just go on here. I can set their IP address. You do have to wait for the DHCP to either time out or go in and restart the DHCP. So there's that. But hopefully we'll get into some pfSense stuff eventually too, because I want to look at that just very briefly in this class, some more of the Unixy things that we can do, and see about that. But anyway, instead of static DNS or static DNS, I'd definitely say look at DHCP static mappings, which are much better in my mind. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions on Lab 3 or 4, Lab 2, any of the stuff we covered today, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, have a good day.